On a pleasantly warm June afternoon, the village green of St. Brindleford looked as though it had stepped neatly out of a postcard. Bunting fluttered from stall to stall, the women's guild bustled with trays of scones drifting in clouds of sugar, and the vicar attempted, without much success, to keep the children from climbing the ancient oak near the duck pond. Everything was entirely ordinary, entirely cheerful, and entirely English. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her distant cousin, Mrs. Agatha Fernley, stood beside the jam-judging table with a polite, approving smile. She wore a soft blue hat trimmed with a modest ribbon and held a paper cup of lemonade as though it were a fascinating artifact, rather than a rather watery beverage. "It's a pleasant tradition," Miss Marple remarked mildly, as Mrs. Fernley fussed over a tray of marmalade jars. "Village fete to bring out a great many personalities." "Personalities, yes," Mrs. Fernley huffed. "And rivalries. You wouldn't believe the trouble over first prize in the plum conserve category. Mrs. Hatchley practically threatened to boycott the raffle if Mabel Finch won again." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Competition does bring curious traits to the surface. Her comment was lost, however, to a sudden, shimmering hush that rippled across the green. The bell tower of St. Winifred's Church, usually silent at this hour, tolled once, deep, resonant, out of place. Heads turned, conversations faltered, even the children at the oak tree paused mid-shout. "That's odd," murmured Mrs. Fernley. "Henry never rings the tower bell on fete day." Miss Marple looked toward the church, a weathered stone building perched just beyond the green, to its ancient bell tower casting a long diagonal shadow across the grass. Something tugged at her attention, the tower's narrow window where, she couldn't be entirely sure, a flicker of movement seemed to shift behind the glass. A second bell strike reverberated, louder and strangely uneven, as though someone unfamiliar with the mechanism had pulled the rope. Then a scream cut through the still air. Not the shriek of a child in play, nor a dramatic fuss over dropped jam. It was a sharp, tearing cry, pure shock, possibly fear, echoing from the direction of the church. Stalls were abandoned instantly. Villagers hurried toward the stone path. Miss Marple, not one to push or rush, let the tide of bodies move ahead, observing quietly. Lady Crowthorne's gloves trembling, Mr. Penburton muttering that children were always up to mischief, to when young Lily March wheeling around in anxious circles, as though unsure whether to run toward or away from the sound. At the church door stood Thomas Bartlett, the caretaker, his face the color of unpasteurized milk. He pointed a shaking hand upward. "In the tower," he gasped. "Someone's up there, someone, oh heavens!" He did not finish. The vicar, pale but determined, pushed past him and hurried up the worn stone steps inside. 2 constables, fortunate enough to be attending the fete, followed him. Miss Marple reached the doorway as Mrs. Hatchley tried to demand an explanation from anyone who would listen. "I said it had begun oddly," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Fernley. "Bell towers do not ring themselves." Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wax and old hymnals. The footsteps above were accompanied now by voices, startled and confused, increasingly grim. When the first constable descended, he flinched at the sight of the villagers crowding below. "Stay back, all of you, please," he insisted. But the news was already spreading, carried on whispers like a dark wind. A body had been found. A girl. In the bell tower. Miss Marple's gentle face creased with concern. Real concern, not the dramatic outrage erupting around her. A young woman dead, here of all places, in the midst of a cheerful village fete. It was an intrusion of cold, unmistakable cruelty into an afternoon meant for tea cakes and raffles. The constables secured the steps, directing villagers outside to give room for the investigation. Mrs. Fernley clutched Miss Marple's sleeve. "How dreadful," she whispered. "Who is she? How did she get there?" "Oh, Jane, can you imagine such a thing?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted upward again, toward the tower window. "Yes," she said softly, almost to herself. "It is dreadful. But more curious still is the manner of her being found. Bells may ring by accident, but rarely twice, and rarely at the very moment a fate is underway." In the swell of commotion, neighbors exclaiming over the identity of the girl, others speculating wildly, Miss Marple noticed things that no one else bothered to see. Thomas Bartlett's hands smudged with dust, though he claimed he had not been inside the tower all morning. Young Lily March slipping away from the crowd with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Hatchley complaining how the tragedy would ruin the day's judging, and Mr. Penberton quietly wiping his spectacles, despite having no apparent reason to do so. Small details, to be sure. But small details were the stitches that held together the fabric of human behavior. A third constable came down the tower steps, flustered. "We've identified her," he announced. "It's Miriam Bell, the seamstress's apprentice." A gasp rolled through the congregation. Miriam, barely 20, shy, polite, hardly the type to climb bell towers or meet with violent ends. Miss Marple's expression tightened. She had met the girl only once, just 2 days prior, when Miriam delivered a set of altered sleeves to Mrs. Fernley. The child had looked troubled, silent in a way that suggested more than mere shyness. Someone tugged at Miss Marple's sleeve. Lily March, the anxious young woman she had noticed earlier, stood there, face blotched and trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, You understand people. You see things." Miss Marple looked at her with warm, steady eyes. "If I can be of help, my dear, I shall certainly try." Lily swallowed. "They're saying she fell, but Miriam, she wouldn't have gone up there alone. She was frightened of heights. Terrified, actually." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then it is very unlikely she climbed that tower of her own accord." Outside, the fete had disintegrated entirely. Cakes were forgotten, ribbons drooped, and the cheerful music from the gramophone had long since been switched off. Villagers clustered in tight circles, whispering, glancing toward the church as though expecting further horrors to emerge from its ancient stones. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly before her. "A tragedy at a fete," she murmured, "and a girl who feared heights found in a tower. There is a story here, I think. One hidden beneath a very old roof." Her voice remained quiet, gentle, but her eyes were already searching, measuring the faces, the reactions, the many small betrayals of fear that ripple through a crowd when they realize a killer may be standing among them. The first drops of rain came just as the bunting was being hastily pulled down. Someone muttered that it was typical, but most barely noticed. They stood in little clusters beneath trees and stalls, driven more by the need to talk than by the need to shelter. By the lemonade stall, Mrs. Hatchley was already in full swing. "Miriam Bell," she repeated in a tone that suggested personal affront. "Of all girls, and at the fete, it's not decent, that's what it isn't. I always said there was something not quite straightforward about that sewing shop." Now, murmured Lady Crowthorne, whose gloves had ceased trembling and were now fluttering for emphasis instead. "Poor creature, we mustn't malign the dead." "Oh, I don't malign," Mrs. Hatchley said with relish. "I merely observe. There's that mother of hers. What is she? A widow? And no one ever quite sure where the money came from when she set Miriam up with that apprenticeship. I heard talk of a gentleman helping. Quietly, you understand." "Ladies," Mr. Penberton interjected, spectacles gleaming faintly after so much polishing, "if we're to behave with any decorum, perhaps we should refrain from speculation. The police will handle it." Which, in village parlance, was permission to speculate more quietly. Across the green, Miss Marple and Mrs. Fernley had taken refuge beneath a striped awning, abandoned now by its original stall-holder, and Lily March sat on the inverted crate beside them, fingers twisted together, her eyes never quite still. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "Miriam and I, We lived on the same lane for years. She was so careful. She hated the bell tower. She told me once that the sound of the bell made her feel trapped. Miss Marple regarded the girl thoughtfully. Lily was 23, perhaps, with an anxious prettiness that had not quite realized it was pretty. She wore a simple blue frock, and her shoes were scuffed, as though she walked far more than she rode. She was the sort of girl, Miss Marple thought, who would take on extra worry simply because no one else seemed inclined to do so. "You were good friends?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lily hesitated. Not lately. We used to be when we were younger, but then she started working more at the seamstresses, and her eyes flicked toward the church. She became different, jumpy, secretive almost. One never knew if she would say yes to seeing you, or claim to be too tired. "That can happen with work," Mrs. Fernley said, "and with growing up. Girls change a very great deal between 19 and 20. "Yes," Lily murmured, but without conviction. On the path leading to the lich gate, the two constables conferred with a taller man in a dark overcoat who had just arrived in a motor car. He carried himself with a brisk, practical air and seemed faintly irritated by the weather, the crowd, and the very existence of a bell tower. "That will be Inspector Graves," Mrs. Fernley supplied. "From the division. He was here last year about the bank robbery in Gresham. Very particular about time, as I recall. Imagine questioning me about how long my errands in the village took." "Oh, time is a very curious thing to ask about," Miss Marple said, watching him. "People so rarely keep it as accurately as they think they do." Inspector Graves wasted none of his. Within minutes, he had taken control of the situation, sending one constable to keep the crowd from pressing toward the church, and dispatching the other to fetch statements from key witnesses. "We'll need everyone who saw the girl today," he announced. "Anyone who spoke to her in the last 24 hours, and whoever rang that bell if it wasn't the caretaker." Thomas Bartlett, summoned again, stood before the inspector, hat clutched to his chest. "I never touched the rope, sir," he insisted, voice quavering. "Not since morning service. I was at the green all afternoon, Haas helping with the coconut shy. Ask anyone." "I shall," Graves replied curtly. "But bells don't ring themselves, Mr. Bartlett. You're responsible for that tower." Thomas's eyes slid away, not toward the bell tower, but toward the far corner of the green, where a narrow lane wound between hedgerows, leading up toward the old rectory and beyond it to a cluster of cottages. His gaze lingered for half a second, then snapped back guiltily. Miss Marple, noticing, filed that small fact away. Statements began to be taken in the vestry, and people went in and out with the solemn air of those entering a confessional. Mrs. Hatchley came out flushed and important, announcing loudly that she had told the inspector everything and that he had seemed very interested in her opinion of Miriam's unsuitable associations, though what those might be she did not specify to anyone who hadn't the patience to coax them out. Lady Crowthorne emerged shortly after, dabbing her eyes and complaining that the questions had been very direct, almost rude, which everyone took as a sign that the inspector had asked something she'd rather not have aired. When at last Lily was called, she rose with a visible shiver. "Oh, Jane," Mrs. Fernley murmured, "do go with her, you being a relation and older." "My dear Agatha," Miss Marple said in a mild tone, "I'm quite certain the inspector does not need an elderly lady to hold the hand of his witnesses." But she rose nonetheless, patting Lily's arm. "You will do very well. My dear, just tell him the truth. It saves one from a great deal of remembering later." Lily gave her a wan smile and disappeared into the church. Miss Marple, finding herself momentarily unoccupied, drifted to the edge of the green, where the view of the bell tower was unobstructed. The small arched door at its base, half hidden from the main entrance of the church, was now guarded by a constable. The stone leading up to it was worn, as stone becomes where human feet regularly pass. A shallow groove in the threshold suggested years of use, but there was a darker scuff at the edge. Recent, she guessed, and not aligned with the usual path. "Excuse me, madam," the constable said automatically as she peered with apparent vagueness at the ground. "You'll have to step back, if you please." "I'm so sorry," Miss Marple said at once, on retreating with an apologetic smile. "One does get in the way, I know. I was only remembering a church in St. Mary Mead where the tower steps were frightfully narrow. Our postman slipped once and broke a tooth. Most unfortunate." "Ah," the constable said, with the sympathetic blankness of a man to whom old ladies' anecdotes occurred frequently and without warning. But Miss Marple had seen what she wanted. A faint smear of something dark on the second stone step, just where a hurried foot might stray. Blood, perhaps, or mud mixed with something else. It was difficult to tell from a distance, but the shape of the mark suggested a sliding motion rather than a simple footprint. Back under the awning, Mrs. Fernley was heating up with indignation. "They'll be trampling about my kitchen next," she declared. "See, asking what time Miriam brought the sleeves on Tuesday and whether she stayed 5 minutes or 10, as though any of that could have to do with murder." "It very often has to do with something," Miss Marple replied placidly. "People seldom move about without a reason, you know. The difficulty, in my experience, lies in sorting out the reasons that matter from the reasons that merely seem interesting." "What do you suppose her reason was for going into that tower?" Mrs. Fernley asked, lowering her voice. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the church once more, on the silent bell tower and the narrow window near the top. "Fear seldom takes one upward by choice," she said quietly. "So if Miriam feared heights, as Lily says, there must have been something, or someone, so important it outweighed her fear. That, or she did not go up under her own power at all." Mrs. Fernley shuddered. "You mean someone might have carried her?" "Carried, persuaded, lured," Miss Marple said, as though listing items for the weekly shop. "Human nature, dear Agatha, has a remarkable assortment of methods for getting what it wants." Lily returned from her interview pale but composed. "He asked about Sunday evening and the last time I saw her," she reported, "and whether Miriam had any acquaintances. Men, I mean. I told him I didn't know of any. She never mentioned. Well, not by name, anyway." "Not by name," Miss Marple repeated gently. Lily colored. "Sometimes she'd say she had someone to see, that was all. Late deliveries, she called them. But the shop closes at 6. I thought, well, perhaps she was ashamed of something, or someone. And now they will all say she must have gone to meet a man in the bell tower," Mrs. Fernley sniffed, "as though girls dash up church towers every time they fancy a talk in private." Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze drifted toward the narrow lane that Thomas Bartlett had glanced at so anxiously. Somewhere along that lane, behind tidy hedges and lace-curtained windows, lay the first threads of a pattern she only half discerned. The fete was officially declared closed. People gathered up their cakes and preserves with a solemn air, as though they were clearing away decorations after a funeral. Yet even as they went home, they continued to talk. About Miriam, about the bell, about who had been where, at what time. Entire narratives were being built, altered, contradicted, strengthened. By the time the lamps were lit in St. Brindleford that evening, the village had already produced 3 thoroughly implausible explanations for Miriam Bell's death, and at least one quite convincing false suspect. Miss Marple listened to them all over supper at Mrs. Fernley's table, her knitting clicking softly in her hands. She did not yet know who had taken Miriam Bell into the tower, or why. But she did know this. Somewhere among those neatly presented village stories, one small inconsistency would soon reveal itself. And when it did, it would lead, as such things always did in her experience, straight to the heart of the matter, and to the person who had rung a bell to announce a tragedy to an unsuspecting fate. Night settled over St. Brindleford with a heaviness unusual for June, as though the village itself understood that something had gone terribly wrong. The lamps glowed weakly through lace curtains, but the usual warmth, the comfortable hum of teapots, the distant laughter from open windows, felt muted, subdued. The rain had stopped, yet the cobblestones gleamed as though still absorbing the day's shock. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Fernley's parlour, the tick of the mantel clock accompanying the soft click of her knitting needles. She had scarcely progressed half a row. Her thoughts were too occupied to maintain their usual rhythm. Mrs. Fernley sat opposite with a newspaper she wasn't really reading, her brow furrowed and her spectacles perched halfway down her nose. "It's dreadful, Jane," she said at last, folding the newspaper and placing it on her lap. "Inspector Graves will be all over the village tomorrow. Interviews, questions, doubt thrown over respectable households. I don't like it. Saint, Brindleford isn't the sort of place for murder." Miss Marple's needles paused. "My dear Agatha, no place is the sort of place for murder, but it happens all the same." Mrs. Fernley sighed deeply. "I suppose you're right. Still, I can't imagine who would wish harm to Miriam. A quiet girl, and barely more than a child." Miss Marple resumed knitting, but her eyes were distant. Quiet people are not exempt from trouble. Sometimes they are more acquainted with it than others suspect. Mrs. Fernley shivered. "You sound as though you think the girl had secrets." "Most people do," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It is simply a matter of whether the secrets are shared or merely observed." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted them. Mrs. Fernley startled, nearly dropping her spectacles. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "At this hour?" "Mrs. Fernley muttered, bustling out of the room. Miss Marple heard the door open, then the low murmur of voices. A moment later, the parlour door reopened and Inspector Graves stepped inside, removing his hat out of courtesy but still exuding the brisk air of a man determined to finish a long day's work. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod. "Mrs. Fernley, I apologize for calling so late." "Think nothing of it," Mrs. Fernley assured him, though her voice betrayed her nerves. "Is something the matter?" The inspector remained standing, his posture firm. "I've just completed further examination of the tower. Initial signs indicate that Miriam Bell did not fall accidentally. There were marks, drag marks, on the upper steps." Mrs. Fernley stifled a gasp. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She had suspected as much. "I have reason to believe," Graves continued, "that Miriam was dead before the bell was rung." Mrs. Fernley pressed a hand to her throat. "Before? Oh, how horrible." "The bell itself was rung shortly past 4, Graves said. "I've been working to establish Miriam's whereabouts earlier in the day. Several villagers claim to have seen her walking toward the green around 3:30. No one admits to seeing her after that. I wondered whether either of you, Miss Marple especially, might recall something helpful." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Inspector, you flatter me. I fear I observed nothing of significance beyond the usual bustle of the fete. But you were near the church just before the alarm," Graves persisted. "I was told you were among the first to notice something amiss." "I heard the bell," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Ah, as did everyone else." The inspector seemed prepared for that answer, but watched her closely all the same. If Miss Marple was aware of the scrutiny, she did not show it. "What I can say," she continued, "is that the caretaker, Thomas Bartlett, appeared very distressed, and his distress did not seem entirely attributable to shock. I also recall a smudge of something dark on the lower stone steps." Graves nodded slowly. "Possibly blood, though faint. We've taken a scraping to examine in better light." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Then it may be quite telling." He gave her a small, wry smile. "You do have a reputation, Miss Marple. I'll not deny that I welcome your eye for oddities, provided it doesn't lead the villagers to hysteria." "Oh, I never stir hysteria," she assured him. "I merely knit." Graves chuckled despite himself, and then sobered. "One more matter. Lily March. She seemed frightened during her interview. not merely distressed. Frightened. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Yes, Lily is a sensitive girl, but I suspect there is more to her fear than grief alone. You believe she knows something? I believe, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that Lily March fears someone, and that this someone is connected to Miriam's final hours. Inspector Graves regarded her with renewed interest. If you learn anything specific, please notify me at once. I'll be lodging at the inn. With a curt nod to both women, he departed, leaving a silence that seemed louder than his presence. Mrs. Fernley sank heavily into her chair. Jane, Lily, she wouldn't withhold anything important, surely. The poor child is half afraid of her own shadow. That may be, Miss Marple said, was retrieving her knitting, but shadows fall for a reason. Mrs. Fernley blinked. Whatever do you mean? Miss Marple considered the rows of stitches forming beneath her fingers. People are often frightened of those who know their weaknesses, or of those who hold them in their power. If Lily is afraid, someone has made her so. And that someone might be a murderer, Mrs. Fernley whispered. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, precisely. It is quite possible. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, a lone carriage rattled along the lane, the sound fading into the still night. At last, Miss Marple laid down her knitting again. I think, Agatha dear, that I shall take a brief walk tomorrow morning, before breakfast. Villages are most revealing in the early hours, before their inhabitants have decided what stories they wish to tell. Mrs. Fernley looked alarmed. Jane, you won't go near the tower. Oh no, Miss Marple said lightly. Not the tower, not yet. She glanced toward the window, where the moonlight cast a faint silver line along the sill. No, she repeated softly, almost to herself. Tomorrow I shall visit the sewing shop. It is there, I believe, that Miriam Bell began the last chapter of her life, and where someone, perhaps, left a thread loose. Her eyes sparkled with quiet certainty. And loose threads, as I often find, she said, tend to lead directly to the heart of a mystery. Morning arrived with a pale, misty light that softened the rooftops of St. Brindleford and laid a hush upon the village lanes. It was the sort of morning that encouraged reflection, and that, Miss Marple thought, made people careless with the small truths they attempted to hide. As she set out before Mrs. Fernley had come down to breakfast, leaving a brief note on the kitchen table so as not to alarm her cousin. Her steps along the damp cobblestones were slow but purposeful. Birds chirped hesitantly, as though unsure whether cheerfulness was appropriate after the previous day's events. The sewing shop, Bell and Button, stood at the end of a row of modest cottages just off the main high street. Its window displayed 3 mannequins dressed in simple frocks, each neatly stitched but plain in design. Miriam's handiwork, Miss Marple suspected. The girl had an eye for clean lines and small, meticulous details, things seldom appreciated by the louder personalities of St. Brindleford. Miss Marple paused before entering. The shop door was closed, the curtains half drawn. A sign reading open hung crookedly, as though placed hastily. She knocked gently, expecting no answer this early, but after a moment the handle rattled and the door opened a cautious few inches. Mrs. Edith Bell, thin and drawn, peered out. Her graying hair was pinned in a way that suggested she had dressed in haste. The faintest tremor of fatigue lingered around her. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it?" she whispered, voice dry as parchment. "Yes, my dear. I hoped I might speak with you for a few minutes, if it's not an inconvenience." Mrs. Bell stepped aside with a defeated sort of nod, and Miss Marple entered the narrow shop. The familiar smell of muslin, chalk, and lavender sachets hung in the air, but beneath it all lingered something faintly metallic. Fear, perhaps, or sorrow, wearing its physical scent. The workroom door at the back stood ajar, where Miss Marple glimpsed a stool overturned beneath the window, a basket of thread spilt across the floor. Mrs. Bell quickly closed the door. "I haven't had the strength to tidy," she said. "Forgive the state of things." "There is nothing to forgive," Miss Marple assured her, settling onto a small cushioned bench. "You have suffered a terrible shock." Mrs. Bell pressed her hands together tightly. "She was a good girl, Miss Marple. Quiet, yes, but good. She worked hard. She did not deserve—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple let the silence rest gently between them until Mrs. Bell regained composure. "I understand Inspector Graves questioned you late last night?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Briefly. He wanted to know when Miriam left the shop yesterday morning. It was just before noon. She had a delivery to take to Mrs. Albright. After that—" Mrs. Bell shook her head. "I don't know. She didn't come back." "You were not expecting her to return?" "Around 4, perhaps, to help with the evening hymns." Her eyes grew distant. "But when she wasn't back by 5, I assumed she had gone straight to the fete. She mentioned wanting to see the Mrs. Finch's new embroidery store." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Did Miriam ever behave differently these past weeks? More secretive? More anxious?" Mrs. Bell's expression changed, subtly but unmistakably. Her gaze dropped to her hands. "I don't pry," she murmured. "Girls her age often have private matters. But she was troubled. I noticed it. She would startle at every knock on the door, and once, just last week, I found her crying in the workroom. She said it was from exhaustion." Her lips tightened. "But exhaustion doesn't leave bruises." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Bruises, my dear. A faint one on her wrist, purple, as though from fingers. She tried to hide it. That must have worried you." "It did," Mrs. Bell whispered, "but she begged me not to ask, and I was afraid she might leave the shop if I pressed her. I'm not wealthy, Miss Marple. Miriam was all I had, all this shop had." Miss Marple reached out and touched her arm lightly. "We often regret the things we do not ask, but you cared for her. That matters more now than the rest." At that moment, the front door opened with a jangle of its tiny bell. A tall figure entered, Lily March, pale from lack of sleep but determined in her steps. When she saw Miss Marple, she froze. "Oh," she breathed, "I didn't expect—" "Mrs. Bell, I came to see if you needed anything. Food, or tea." Miss Marple noted the girl's hands twisting in her coat pockets, a sign of nerves she recognized from the previous day. "My dear," Miss Marple said warmly, "you're very kind to visit." Lily hesitated, then stepped inside fully, shutting the door behind her. Her eyes flicked briefly to the closed workroom, then back to Mrs. Bell. "I didn't sleep," she confessed suddenly. "All night I kept thinking about her. I keep wondering if there was something I should have done, something she wanted to tell me but couldn't." Mrs. Bell gave a tearful nod in agreement. Miss Marple watched Lily's distress with gentle precision. "Perhaps there was," she said softly. "People seldom hold fear entirely alone. Even secrets have a way of whispering at the edges." Lily looked startled. "Secrets?" "Girls often tell small things in passing," Miss Marple said, "especially to old friends. A worry, a name, a time she needed to be somewhere. Anything that didn't seem important then but might be now." Lily swallowed. Her gaze drifted to the mannequin nearest the door, and for a moment she seemed ready to speak openly. But something clenched inside her. Her shoulders tensed. She shook her head faintly. I don't know." Miss Marple did not press. Pressure seldom yielded truth, only resistance. "Lily," she said quietly, "fear is a curious companion. It can make one see danger everywhere, or it can make one ignore danger entirely, but I promise you this. Whatever frightened Miriam need not frighten you alone." Lily's lips trembled. She nodded mutely, then turned abruptly toward Mrs. Bell. "I'll bring you tea later," she whispered, and with a curt excuse fled the shop. Mrs. Bell looked after her sorrowfully. "Poor child," She and Miriam used to sit on the green together every Sunday, but lately they barely spoke. "Drifting apart is common," Miss Marple said, "but the reasons seldom are." She rose slowly, smoothing her coat. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell. You have been very helpful." Mrs. Bell managed a wan smile. "If you learn anything at all, I will come at once," Miss Marple promised. Outside, the morning mist had lifted somewhat, revealing the narrow lane Lily had hurried down. Miss Marple followed at her own gentle pace, her mind arranged neatly like threads on a bobbin. At the corner where the hedgerows grew thick, she paused. A faint indentation marked the damp earth. Fresh footprints, small, quick, and taken by someone in distress. Lily's, undoubtedly. But nearby, another set of footprints diverged up a side path toward the old rectory. Larger, deeper, made earlier that same morning. Thomas Bartlett had glanced this way yesterday with unmistakable guilt. Miss Marple studied the path a moment longer, then turned back toward Mrs. Fernley's house. She had no intention of confronting anyone yet, not until the pattern became clearer. But one certainty had emerged. Miriam Bell had been pulled into someone's orbit long before she entered the bell tower, and that orbit had not broken with her death. It had merely shifted, leaving behind traces, marks, and frightened young women who pretended not to see the shadows behind them. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her handbag. Human nature, she reflected. They always left footprints, no matter how carefully a person tried to hide their tracks. Miss Marple reached Mrs. Fernley's gate just as the church bell struck 9. Not the ominous toll of the previous day, but a steady, measured chime that seemed almost to reassure the village that ordinary life still attempted to go on. Mrs. Fernley herself appeared at the doorway, apron still tied over her morning dress, her expression strained with curiosity and worry. "Jane, I was nearly beside myself when I saw your note. Out walking before breakfast, honestly. It's not a sensible hour, especially after yesterday's events." "My dear Agatha," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, "danger seldom follows old ladies out on their morning strolls. Criminals, I find, tend to prefer more agile prey." Mrs. Fernley huffed but ushered her inside with relief. "Well, why, sit down at once. You look as though you've weathered half the day already." Tea was poured, toast buttered, and a modest calm returned to the kitchen. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts rested not on the jam dish or the warmth of the teacup, but on the sewing shop, on Lily's wide, frightened eyes, and on the path bearing 2 distinct pairs of footprints. "I visited Mrs. Bell," she said at last. Mrs. Fernley froze mid-sip. "Good heavens, and how is she taking it?" "As one might expect," Miss Marple murmured. "Grief-stricken, shocked. But there are elements that trouble me." "Trouble you?" "Oh, Jane, don't say things like that without explaining." Miss Marple stirred her tea with a slow, thoughtful motion. Mrs. Bell mentioned Miriam had been anxious these past weeks, startled easily, and once she bore a bruise, faint but distinct, shaped like fingers gripping her wrist. Mrs. Fernley gasped loudly. "A man, then? Oh, it must be. Young girls don't bruise each other like that." "Not usually," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But bruises can come from many sources. Force, restraint, even fear itself made physical." Mrs. Fernley looked baffled. "Fear doesn't leave bruises." "Oh, my dear, it can. It manifests in curious ways. Nervous clumsiness, shaking hands, stumbling into objects. But in this case," Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly, "I believe Miriam's bruise came from someone else's hand." Mrs. Fernley's lips tightened into a line of worry. "Lily March was there when you visited, wasn't she? Poor child. I imagine she must be inconsolable." "She is frightened," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not merely grieving, frightened." "Of whom?" Miss Marple hesitated only a heartbeat. "That is what we must determine. Before Mrs. Fernley could respond, a firm rapping echoed across the front hallway. Her head snapped toward the door. Another caller? Before 10. This village has quite forgotten its manners. Inspector Graves stood on the step when she opened the door. He inclined his head briskly, stepping inside with an air of urgency. "Apologies again," he said, with far less formality than the previous night. "But new information has come to light, and I need Miss Marple's recollection of the fete grounds." Mrs. Fernley blinked in astonishment. "Jane? But she hardly saw anything. She told you that." Miss Marple rose, setting her napkin aside. "What has happened, Inspector?" Graves removed his hat and lowered his voice. A parcel was found behind the vestry. Small, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a blue thread. Mrs. Bell identified it as Miriam's stitching cord. Mrs. Fernley clasped a hand to her mouth. "It contained," he continued, "a torn scrap of fabric, stained slightly with what appears to be blood." He reached into his coat and produced a small notebook. But the most significant detail is the handwriting on the paper, a single initial. T. Miss Marple's eyes softened knowingly. "Thomas Bartlett. That is one possibility. The caretaker was near the tower frequently, and his behavior yesterday was inconsistent." Graves' voice hardened. "I interviewed him again this morning. His explanation for leaving the fete briefly at 3:30 does not hold." "Oh dear," Mrs. Fernley whispered. "So then he may have done it." Miss Marple did not look convinced. "People lie for many reasons, Inspector. Guilt may be only one of them." "Yes," Graves admitted reluctantly, "but a torn, bloodied scrap hidden behind the church suggests someone wished it found or wished to divert attention." Mrs. Fernley looked bewildered. "Divert? But why would a culprit draw attention to anything at all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because misleading is easier than hiding. Give an investigator one suspicious object, one clear initial, and he may stop looking for the subtler truths." Graves gave a grim nod, as though her words struck uncomfortably close to a private suspicion. "Regardless, I need to know whether Miss Marple noticed anything unusual behind the vestry yesterday afternoon. Anyone lingering there? Anyone carrying a parcel or behaving furtively?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "I did not go behind the vestry, but I did notice something curious while near the church path." "What was that?" "A scuff on the step. Dark, smudged, as though someone moved in great haste. And Bartlett's hands bore dust, though he insisted he had not been inside the tower." Graves snapped his notebook shut. "Enough to warrant further questioning. Or," Miss Marple added kindly, "enough to warrant deeper thought. Sometimes the person who seems frightened is not dangerous, but afraid of someone who is." Graves exhaled sharply. "You mean Lily March?" Mrs. Fernley looked alarmed. "Inspector, surely you don't think Lily—" "No," Graves said quickly. "But Miss Marple believes she knows more than she has admitted, so which raises questions." "Fair," Miss Marple said softly. "Often keeps the tongue still." Graves looked from her to the closed sitting-room window, where the street lay quiet in the growing sunlight. "I intend to speak with Lily again," he said. "She may deny it, but something has shaken her deeply." Miss Marple's voice remained calm but firm. "I would advise gentleness, Inspector. Lily is a fragile piece of this puzzle. Press too hard and she may break, and broken pieces tell very little." Graves studied her a moment. "Then how would you suggest I proceed?" Miss Marple smiled. "Let her think she is helping someone else. People often reveal truths when they believe them harmless, or when they believe those truths belong to another person entirely." Graves tucked his notebook away. "Then I shall keep that in mind." He left with determined footsteps, Mrs. Fernley closing the door behind him with a flutter of nerves. "Oh, Jane," she said, turning back toward the kitchen, "all of this is becoming far too dark. Murder, bruises, parcels left like messages. And now Lily. Do you really think she is in danger?" Miss Marple walked to the window, watching a pair of sparrows hop across the cobblestones. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think someone is watching her closely." She paused, her expression contemplative. And frightened watchers can be just as dangerous as those they fear. Mrs. Fernley steadied herself on a chair. "Then what should we do?" "For now, dear Agatha, we observe," Miss Marple replied with that same serene certainty that always masked sharp, rapid deductions beneath. "We listen, and we wait for the smallest detail, the one others overlook, to reveal itself." Outside, the village was stirring. Doors opened, shopkeepers set out signs, neighbors exchanged cautious greetings. The world had resumed its shape, but under its surface something shifted. Restless, unseen. Miss Marple noted two figures at the far end of the lane. Lily March, walking quickly toward the green. And behind her, not too close, not too far, Thomas Bartlett, keeping to the shadows of the hedgerows, watching her with an expression she could not yet decipher. Her fingers tightened slightly on the windowsill. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Patterns do so love to repeat themselves. And there, I believe, is the beginning of a very important one." She reached for her coat, so it was time to follow the threads to wherever they led, before someone else pulled them tighter. Miss Marple left Mrs. Fernley's house at an unhurried pace, but her eyes followed the lane keenly. Lily March had already turned the corner toward the green. Thomas Bartlett remained several yards behind, pausing now and then as though unsure whether to continue following or to retreat. His shoulders were hunched, his gait stiff with worry or guilt. Miss Marple had seen many expressions of guilt in her time, and she knew well enough that guilt did not always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it meant knowing something one had no wish to reveal. She kept her distance, allowing the hedgerows and the faint morning bustle to shield her presence. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke from early fires, the sort that usually evoked comfort. But today it seemed to veil unease. Lily reached the green and crossed it quickly, almost furtively, heading not toward the sewing shop or her cottage, but toward the side lane that curved behind the church. Miss Marple's brows lifted very slightly. The churchyard, at this hour, would be deserted. Lily must have known that. Yet she went still, as though drawn by something she could not avoid. Thomas Bartlett hesitated at the edge of the green, wiping his palms on his trousers, glancing in every direction except the one that mattered. Then, gathering some measure of resolve, he followed. Miss Marple took a different route, one that would bring her to the churchyard gate from the opposite side. It would never do to appear as though she were trailing them intentionally. People closed up like long unused cupboards the moment they felt watched, and the churchyard lay quiet as ever, gravestones nestled among moss and unruly grass. A soft wind pushed the tree shadows back and forth like restless spirits. Lily stood near the stone bench beneath the yew tree, arms wrapped around herself, staring toward the bell tower door. Bartlett approached her cautiously, almost timidly, stopping several paces away. Miss Marple paused beside a tall headstone just outside their line of sight, adjusting her scarf in a very innocent manner. Lily spoke first, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why are you following me?" Bartlett flinched. I wasn't, Miss Lily. Only wanted to be sure you were all right." "That's not true," she said, taking a step back. "You've been watching me since yesterday. I saw you at the fete, too, staring at Miriam before the bell rang." Bartlett's face contorted with pain. "I wasn't staring at her. I was trying to get her attention. She wouldn't look at me." Lily's breath caught. "So you admit you were with her?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, I never touched her. I swear it." "Then why?" Lily demanded. "Did she tell me she was afraid someone would come looking for her, that she had done something she could never undo?" Bartlett stepped forward instinctively, hands raised in protest, but Lily shrank back, her shoulders pressing into the stone bench. Miss Marple saw the truth then. He meant no harm, but he carried a burden he didn't know how to set down. "Miss Lily," he said with desperate urgency, "I need to talk to you, properly. I need to explain." "I don't want to hear it," Lily whispered. People will think, people will say." Bartlett's voice broke. "They'll think I killed her." He pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. "Inspector Graves already thinks so, but I didn't. I didn't hurt Miriam." Silence settled heavily between them. At last, Lily whispered, "Then why are you so frightened?" Bartlett lowered his hand. His expression was stricken but honest. "Because Miriam told me something. Something she shouldn't have, maybe. And now she's dead, and I think someone believes I know more than I do." Lily paled. "What did she tell you?" Bartlett hesitated, swallowing hard. "She said someone had discovered her secret, and that she needed to speak to you, only you, before it was too late." Miss Marple felt the quiet click of a piece sliding neatly into place, though she kept her posture perfectly still. Lily shook her head in confusion. "Me? But I don't. What secret? She never told me any." Bartlett stepped closer, desperate. "Miss Lily, please. If she trusted you, then you must know something, even if it's small, even if it seems nothing at all." "I don't." Lily's voice rose, raw with fear. "She never said anything to me, not really. Only that someone was angry with her, and that she had something that didn't belong to her." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. Something that didn't belong to her. A scrap of fabric found behind the vestry. A bruise on her wrist, and now a secret only Lily was meant to hear. Bartlett's expression crumpled. "Then she meant to tell you, but never had the chance." His hands trembled violently now. I saw her arguing with someone last week, near the rectory path, and I couldn't hear what was said, but she looked terrified." "Who was the other person?" Lily breathed. Bartlett opened his mouth. But before he could answer, the sharp crunch of footsteps approached from the gate. Lily whirled, startled, as Inspector Graves strode into the churchyard, his presence abrupt enough to scatter the fragile honesty forming between the two. Bartlett stiffened like a frightened rabbit. "Miss March," Graves said with a clipped nod. "Mr. Bartlett, I see I've interrupted a conversation." Lily's hands twisted together. Bartlett stared at the ground. Miss Marple, stepping into view with perfect timing, offered a gentle smile. "Oh, Inspector, I did not expect to see you here quite so early." "I'm following up new evidence," Graves said, eyes fixed on Bartlett. "And it seems fortune has placed one of my key witnesses directly before me." Bartlett swallowed audibly. I'll need you at the station," Graves said. "There are inconsistencies in your account that require clarification." Lily stepped forward unexpectedly. "Inspector, please, he hasn't done anything. He's frightened, that's all." Graves' gaze shifted to her. "And what do you know of his involvement, Miss March?" Lily faltered, unable to answer. Bartlett looked panic-stricken. "I didn't kill her," he whispered hoarsely. "You have to believe that is enough, Mr. Bartlett." Miss Marple moved closer, her voice soft yet commanding. "Inspector, perhaps Mr. Bartlett will speak more freely if allowed a moment to collect himself. Fear muddles recollection. A clear head offers clearer answers." Graves hesitated. Though he was a practical man, he had already learned that Miss Marple's suggestions, however gently phrased, tended to rest on solid foundation. "Very well," he said finally. "But not long." He turned away to adjust his notes, giving Bartlett a few precious seconds. Miss Marple leaned closer to the caretaker. "Mr. Bartlett," she murmured kindly, "you must tell the inspector the truth, but do not let fear rob you of reason. If you remain silent, others will tell the story for you, and they will not tell it kindly." Bartlett nodded, swallowing hard. His eyes flickered toward Lily with a mixture of apology and desperation. Lily whispered, "I don't think he's lying." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But someone else is." Graves stepped back toward them, ready to escort Bartlett away. Before he could speak, Miss Marple cast a final glance at the bell tower. Its stone walls glowed softly in the morning sun, silent as though holding its breath. Something, or someone, still hid within the shadows of yesterday's tragedy. And as Bartlett was led away, Miss Marple sensed that the killer had just been given the perfect opportunity to strike again. Inspector Graves led Thomas Bartlett out of the churchyard with a firm hand on his shoulder, and though Bartlett did not resist, his posture radiated a dread that sank heavily into the cool morning air. Lily remained rooted to the spot, pale and trembling, as though she had just watched a man being led to an execution. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear," she murmured, "try to breathe slowly. Panic makes everything appear larger and more terrible than it is." Lily nodded, as though her breaths still came shallow. "They'll blame him," she whispered. "Everyone will, and if he didn't do anything, if he truly didn't, then the real person—" "Yes," Miss Marple finished softly. "The real person remains free." Lily's gaze flicked toward the bell tower, as if expecting something to emerge from its narrow, arched door. But the tower remained still, the morning sun tracing its worn stones in a deceptively peaceful glow. "Lily," Miss Marple continued gently, "Mr. Bartlett said he saw Miriam arguing with someone near the rectory path. You seemed surprised by that, yet not entirely." Lily shook her head vigorously. "I don't know who it was. Truly, but Miriam. She had grown frightened of someone. She never said a name, and she only said she'd gotten mixed up in something she couldn't undo." "And was someone pressuring her to return something?" Miss Marple asked, recalling Lily's earlier hesitance at the sewing shop. Lily hesitated, biting her lip. She mentioned she had something of value. Something she didn't mean to take, but once she had it, she didn't know how to give it back without making matters worse. Her hands twisted again. She sounded ashamed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That aligned well with Miriam's bruise, her recent anxiety, and the torn scrap of fabric hidden behind the vestry. But how did these pieces link? And what did Miriam believe she had taken that belonged to someone dangerous enough to kill her? Before Miss Marple could ask further, Lily stiffened. Footsteps approached along the graveled path. Light, measured, familiar. The vicar emerged from behind the church wall, carrying a bundle of hymnals. His gentle demeanor seemed unnaturally somber. "Miss Marple, Miss March," he greeted, inclining his head. "A terrible tragedy. I fear the village may not recover its peace for quite some time." Miss Marple examined him carefully. "Indeed, Reverend, these are unsettled days." He sighed and adjusted his spectacles. "I was just replacing the hymnals left out after yesterday's chaotic events. It is difficult to return to routine when the shadow of such a crime hangs over us." His words were sincere, but Miss Marple had known too many vicars in her life to mistake courtesy for transparency. She watched the faint tightening of his jaw as he looked toward the tower, more thoughtful than troubled. "As you were the first to go up the tower stairs after the bell rang," Miss Marple said gently. "That must have been a shock." The vicar's eyes clouded. Yes, it was. I shall not soon forget the sight." Miss Marple watched him a moment longer. His hands trembled only slightly, just enough for someone of her observational caliber to notice. "And the door to the tower?" she asked casually. "Was it locked when you arrived?" He blinked. "Locked?" "No, it was ajar. I assumed the caretaker had left it that way. But Mr. Bartlett insisted he had not entered the tower all afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly, as though making conversation about weather, which would suggest someone else opened it. The vicar paled just slightly. Yes, I suppose so." His voice wavered. "The inspector believes Mr. Bartlett may have Well, yes, Miss Marple replied mildly. But sometimes the simplest path is simply the most obvious, not the most accurate. The vicar nodded, clearly eager to end the topic. If you'll excuse me, I must prepare the chapel for afternoon prayers. And with a hurried bow, he retreated toward the church. Lily watched him go with furrowed brows. Do you think he knows something? Miss Marple considered. I think he knows more than he is comfortable holding. Whether that something pertains directly to Miriam's death remains to be seen. Lily shivered. I wish I weren't part of this. I wish Miriam had never told me anything. The older woman squeezed her arm gently. My dear, troubles often visit those who least deserve them. What matters now is that you do not allow fear to guide your steps. Fear, I find, leads people exactly where a culprit wishes them to go. A carriage rattled past along the main road, drawing their attention. Inspector Graves was inside, with Bartlett seated rigidly beside him. Lily inhaled sharply, panic swelling again, but Miss Marple's steady presence kept her grounded. I should go home, Lily whispered. Before someone else asks questions I can't answer. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But do not be alone if you can help it. People who fear shadows should not walk without light. Lily managed a fragile nod and hurried away. Miss Marple remained in the churchyard for several minutes after, letting the quiet morning settle around her. She walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the ground, the walls, the door frames. At the base of the tower, her gaze lingered on the faint scuff she had noticed the previous day, darkened slightly now that the morning dew had drawn out the discoloration. A hurried foot, a dragged weight, a struggle. She crouched delicately, fingers hovering above the stone but not touching. Something glinted faintly in a crack between two slabs. A thin metal object, shiny, small, half-hidden. A button, perhaps. No, not a button. A fastening clip, the kind used on clerical robes or choir attire. Miss Marple straightened, folding her hands behind her back as though simply observing the flower beds. A choir clasp near the tower step. Unlikely dropped by Miriam. Very likely dropped by someone connected to the church, and perhaps in haste. She walked slowly away, her pace serene, her mind sharpened to a fine point. A bruise on Miriam's wrist, and a scrap of fabric tied with blue thread. A hidden parcel marked with a single initial, T, a vicar flinching at the mention of an unlocked tower door, and a frightened girl who believed she knew nothing, yet held the key to everything. The pattern was beginning to take shape, not complete, not yet sharp, but emerging like embroidery, slowly revealing its picture. Miss Marple tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Someone in St. Brindleford believed they had sealed the past in silence. But silence, she knew, had a habit of unraveling when touched by even the gentlest hands. And her hands, after all, had spent a lifetime handling delicate threads. Miss Marple left the churchyard, with the small gleam of that metal clasp still fixed in her thoughts. But she did not touch it. Inspector Graves would need to see it exactly as it lay, but her mind was already arranging its implications. Such clasps were not commonplace items. They belonged to garments of ceremony, used only by a handful of people in the village. The vicar, the curate who visited once a month, the choir master, and the older choir boys trusted with handling vestments. A narrow circle, a useful circle. Yet the clasp's presence beneath the tower steps suggested an urgency, a movement made in haste, or a hand brushing against stone while pulling or steadying weight, perhaps weight not easily carried. Miss Marple walked toward the high street, allowing the ordinary bustle of village life to fold around her. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds. A milk cart trundled past. Mrs. Hatchley, already positioned near the bakery door, launched into a dramatic retelling of yesterday's events to a cluster of women who likewise seemed unable to resist another hearing of their own embellishments. And the inspector says it was murder. Mark my words, Mrs. Hatchley declared, waving a pastry bag as though presenting courtroom evidence. Dragged up those stairs. Poor girl. I said so the moment I heard that dreadful bell. I know the sound of tragedy. Miss Marple stopped just near enough to hear without being conspicuous. Mrs. Hatchley was rarely accurate, but she often unwittingly echoed village rumors that revealed more about people's hopes and fears than about the truth. Some say she had a secret lover, Mrs. Hatchley continued with relish. Others say she stole something valuable. Aye, and let me tell you, people don't kill without reason. Miss Marple stepped closer to the bakery window, examining a display of currant buns she had no real intention of purchasing. Mrs. Hatchley, she said pleasantly, I wonder if you might tell me something. You knew Miriam reasonably well, didn't you? As well as anyone, Mrs. Hatchley announced, puffing importantly. A shy girl, always rushing about, never looked one in the eye properly, a sign of guilt if ever I saw one. Guilt? Miss Marple smiled benignly. Or shyness. Mrs. Hatchley wiggled her hand as though the distinction hardly mattered. All I know is she'd been acting strangely of late, distracted, and, well, Mabel Finch told me she'd seen Miriam speaking quite urgently with someone near the rectory path last week. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened faintly. Mabel Finch, as you say? And did she mention who that someone was? She did, Mrs. Hatchley said triumphantly, though I'm sure it's nonsense. She claims it was young Geoffrey Randall. The name registered quietly in Miss Marple's thoughts. Geoffrey Randall, the vicar's nephew and occasional choir helper, newly arrived in the village 3 months past. Polite, well-spoken, and overly eager to please, yet with a certain nervous energy, as though he were perpetually waiting for approval that never quite came. He had helped at the fete yesterday, carrying tables and guiding lost children, and he had been notably absent when Miriam's body was discovered. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hatchley, who continued broadcasting theories to anyone within earshot as Miss Marple drifted away. She walked toward the rectory path, the lane lined with tidy hedges and neat pavers. It was a quiet corner of the village. Too quiet, perhaps, for urgent conversations, unless secrecy was desired. At the gate of the rectory garden, Geoffrey Randall emerged, a basket of hymn sheets under his arm. The moment he spotted Miss Marple, he hesitated, his posture tightening like a wire pulled taut. "Good morning," Miss Marple greeted pleasantly. He nodded, his voice a little too quick. "Miss Marple, terrible business yesterday, isn't it? Awful for the whole village." "Yes," she agreed softly, "and particularly for Miriam Bell's friends." Geoffrey's throat bobbed. Yes, of course." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You used to help with the choir vestments, didn't you? Young hands are quite useful for such tasks." A flicker, rapid, unguarded, crossed his face. "Sometimes. Only when Uncle asked." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said with gentle warmth. "I was merely admiring how the church maintains its garments so well, the clasps especially. They're quite distinctive." Another flicker. Then Geoffrey forced a small laugh. "Hardly worth notice, I think." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One never knows what is worth notice, Mr. Randall. I've found many useful things by observing what others overlook." He shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. "If you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." "Of course," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. "Such a conscientious young man. Your uncle must appreciate you." Geoffrey murmured something indistinct and hurried away. Miss Marple watched him until he disappeared around the bend. The tension in his posture, the avoidance in his gaze, these were the small behaviors that spoke louder than words. But she stored each observation carefully, adding it to the growing tapestry of clues. As she continued down the lane, she noticed something curious just beyond the rectory wall. The faint outline of a footpath worn by repeated use. Not an official path, but clearly taken often. It led toward the cluster of cottages where Miriam and Lily lived, and there, near the start of that informal trail, caught on the hedge, was a thread, blue, strong twist, the kind used in the sewing shop. Miss Marple examined it without removing it. A thread alone meant little, but a thread linking the rectory path to Miriam's route home, combined with the clasp beneath the tower and Geoffrey's nervous avoidance, a pattern was indeed forming. She turned back toward Mrs. Fernley's house, but before she reached it, a familiar voice called her name. So it was Inspector Graves, striding toward her with a determined expression. "Miss Marple, I was just coming to find you. We've reached an impasse with Mr. Bartlett. He maintains his innocence, but something is clearly being withheld." "I'm not surprised," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Fear is a formidable jailer." Graves nodded tensely. "He claims Miriam confided something, but he won't say what." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "He's afraid of the wrong person, Inspector. And until he realizes who truly threatens him, he will protect the very individual who endangers him." Graves frowned. "Do you have a name?" "Not yet," she said gently. "But I have suspicions. And suspicions, as I've learned, are like seeds. They grow if placed in the correct soil." He exhaled sharply. "Then what do you suggest?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Let us speak with Lily March again. She's at the center of this web, though she does not yet understand her part." Graves hesitated. "She's very fragile." "All the more reason," Miss Marple said softly, "to approach not with interrogation, but with reassurance. Give her the sense that she is protecting someone. It is amazing what truths emerge when one believes they are shielding another." Graves studied her, then nodded. "Very well. We'll go together." Miss Marple's smile was faint but resolute. The threads were pulling tighter, and soon she knew they would lead straight to the heart of the deceit, where the truth lay waiting, impatient to be uncovered. Inspector Graves and Miss Marple walked side by side along the quiet lane that led toward Lily March's cottage. The morning had grown brighter, yet the village felt no less subdued. The windows opened cautiously, curtains twitched as they passed. News of Bartlett's detainment had spread with predictable speed, and already the village had divided into two camps, those convinced of his guilt and those who insisted he was merely confused, pitiable, and unable to defend himself. Miss Marple noticed it all without comment. St. Brindleford was speaking, loudly in some corners, quietly in others. People revealed far more in their silences than in their words. Lily's cottage stood at the end of a narrow path bordered by lavender shrubs. The scent was soothing, perhaps intentionally so, for Lily had always been a nervous sort, fond of calming things. But when she opened the door to Miss Marple and Inspector Graves, her eyes were swollen, and she clutched a handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. Miss Marple." "Inspector, I wasn't expecting. Please come in." The cottage interior was tidy but trembled with signs of unease. A teacup sat untouched on the table, a shawl lay crumpled on the chair, and a small sewing box was open, threads spilling out in tangled disarray. "I'm sorry for the state of things," Lily murmured, hastily pushing a stack of papers aside. "I haven't slept much." "There is no need to apologize," Miss Marple said, brushing a gentle hand across the girl's shoulder. "You've been through a dreadful ordeal." Graves remained standing, his tone even but not unkind. "Miss March, we won't keep you long. We only hoped you might help clarify a few matters regarding your friend Miriam." Lily's fingers twisted around the handkerchief. "I've told everything I know. Truly I have." Miss Marple sat across from her, and her voice the calm center of the room. "My dear, no one doubts your honesty, but sometimes people share more than they realize. A word here, a moment there, it can be quite important." Lily swallowed. "I would never keep anything that could help." "We know," Miss Marple said gently. "But you may have worried that something Miriam told you was private. Perhaps you believed it wasn't your place to repeat it." Lily's breath caught. Inspector Graves watched her intently. "Miriam told you she feared someone had discovered her secret," Miss Marple continued softly, "and that she wished to speak with you before it was too late." Lily nodded slowly. "Yes, but I didn't know what secret she meant." "But you guessed," Miss Marple said, her tone kind, not accusing. "And that guess frightened you." Lily's eyes darted toward the window as though checking whether anyone lingered outside. "I wasn't sure. It could have been anything. She was so anxious lately. I didn't want to assume." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes assumptions can be helpful if they lead us toward understanding. Did you believe her secret had to do with a person?" Lily hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. "Someone older," Miss Marple suggested. "Someone with authority. Someone who might feel threatened if Miriam spoke openly." Lily's hands trembled. "I didn't want to think so." Inspector Graves' voice was steady. "Miss March, you are not in any danger for telling us the truth. If someone frightened Miriam, if someone frightened you, that person must be stopped." Lily pressed the handkerchief to her mouth, March then dropped it, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Miriam said she had something she wasn't supposed to have, something she found by accident. She didn't say what it was, only that it belonged to someone who would be furious if it got out." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "A document, perhaps? A letter? Something that revealed an indiscretion?" "I don't know," Lily cried. "But she said the person involved didn't know she had it. At first, but later. She thought they suspected." Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "And did she say who the person was?" "No." Lily's voice shrank. But she kept looking over her shoulder whenever she walked past the rectory. She always hurried past it even if she wasn't going that way." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "And did she ever speak with Geoffrey Randall, the vicar's nephew?" Lily's reaction was immediate. Her breath hitched, her eyes widened. Even without speaking, her face betrayed a recognition she had not admitted before. "I didn't see them together much," she whispered. "But once, yes, near the rectory path. She was upset. He looked angry. No, not angry, just strained, as though he was begging her not to do something." Graves stepped forward. "Did Miriam tell you what they argued about?" "No. But afterward, she said she didn't trust him, that he wanted something from her. She said she'd made a mistake, getting involved in affairs that weren't hers." Miss Marple absorbed this in quiet contemplation. "Affairs," she repeated softly. A telling word. Lily stared into her lap. "Do you think Geoffrey killed her?" Miss Marple answered carefully. "I think Geoffrey Randall is frightened. And fear, my dear, is a powerful motivator, for truth and for wrongdoing." Inspector Graves straightened. "Miss March, we may need to speak with you again later, but you have been very helpful." Lily nodded weakly. Miss Marple rose but did not move toward the door immediately. Instead, she glanced at the small sewing box on the table. Amid the scattered threads lay a folded paper, old, frayed at the edges, and very deliberately tucked beneath a thimble. "Lily?" Miss Marple asked gently. "What is that?" Lily followed her gaze and stiffened. "It's nothing. Just something of Miriam's she left with me weeks ago. A pattern sketch. I forgot it was there." But Miss Marple saw the slight tremor in the girl's hand as she reached for it. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "Miriam trusted you, and now we must trust you as well. If she left something with you, it was because she feared what might happen if it stayed in her possession." Lily swallowed hard, then handed the folded paper to Miss Marple. The older woman opened it carefully. It was not a sewing pattern. It was a torn fragment of a letter. And at the top, in a hand both elegant and unmistakable, was the beginning of a signature, just the first curve of a name. G. Lily whispered, "I didn't know what it meant. I was afraid to look." Miss Marple folded the paper again with meticulous care. It was no longer a question of whether Geoffrey Randall was involved. The question now was how far he, or someone using his name, would go to keep their secrets hidden, and whether another life might be in danger before the truth came fully to light. Nurse Inspector Graves stared at the folded fragment in Miss Marple's hand, as though it might ignite. His jaw tightened, not with surprise. He had already sensed the direction of things, but with the weary frustration of a man realizing the path ahead was far more tangled than anticipated. "That," he said quietly, "is not proof, but it is something close to it." Miss Marple nodded, slipping the fragment safely into her handbag. "It is an indication, Inspector. Nothing more. But indications, like threads, tend to lead if one follows them patiently." Lily clasped her hands together, her voice barely above a whisper. He wouldn't hurt her, would he? Geoffrey seemed kind. Nervous, yes, but kind. Miss Marple watched the girl for a moment, her expression softening. Nervous people are seldom harmless, my dear. They carry the weight of their own fears, and sometimes, too often, they place that weight upon others. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "I'll need to speak to Geoffrey immediately. If he has any explanation for this, any innocent explanation, we must hear it." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But do tread gently. A frightened man can be unpredictable." Lily flinched. You don't think he would harm someone else?" Miss Marple took her hand, patting it kindly. "No one wants to believe ill of those they know, but guilt, fear, desperation, they are strong forces, and Miriam, poor child, became entangled in something beyond her strength. We must ensure no one else does." Graves stepped toward the door. "Miss March, thank you for your help. Stay indoors for now, and lock your door this evening." Lily nodded with a subdued sob as they left her cottage. The moment they were outside, Graves turned to Miss Marple. "If Geoffrey is involved, we can't delay. I'll call at the rectory at once." Miss Marple walked beside him down the quiet lane. "Yes, Inspector, but permit me to ask one thing first. Do you believe Geoffrey acted alone?" Graves frowned. "You think someone else is implicated?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people rarely commit dangerous acts without influence. Whether that influence is fear of exposure, an emotional entanglement, or a pressure from someone more authoritative, that remains to be seen." Graves grunted, his suspicion sharpening. "The vicar?" "A possibility," Miss Marple admitted. "He seemed troubled by more than mere grief this morning." "But surely he—" Miss Marple gave him a small, meaningful look. "Inspector, my experience has taught me not to assume moral virtue simply because one wears a clerical collar." They reached the rectory gate. The house loomed quietly behind its hedges, its windows innocently reflecting the sun. But somewhere inside, the threads of the truth were tightening. Graves marched up the path and knocked sharply. For several moments, nothing stirred. Then the door opened, and the vicar himself appeared, pale, drawn, and visibly unsettled. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he forced a smile. "To what do I owe the visit?" "Where is your nephew?" Graves asked without preamble. The vicar blinked. "Geoffrey. He's resting. He was up much of the night. This whole tragedy has affected him terribly." Graves' voice cooled. "I'll need to speak to him." The vicar hesitated. A flicker of something crossed his expression, not refusal exactly, but alarm. He isn't well. Perhaps later." "No," Graves said firmly. "Now." Miss Marple watched the exchange without comment, though her attention sharpened. The vicar's hesitation was not the guarded protectiveness of an innocent guardian. It was something deeper, older, more complex. "Very well," the vicar said at last, stepping aside. "Come in." The rectory interior smelled faintly of dust and old prayer books. Sunlight filtered in through high windows. Everything was neat, meticulous, except for a small stack of books on a side table, toppled as though brushed in haste. The vicar led them toward the study. As they reached the doorway, Geoffrey Randall appeared, standing rigidly beside the desk, his face pale as paper. He clutched the back of the chair as though needing support. "Inspector Graves," he said, voice shaking. "Miss Marple." Graves stepped forward. "Mr. Randall, we've obtained new information concerning Miriam Bell. We need you to answer some questions." Geoffrey's eyes darted to the vicar, then back. I have nothing to say." Miss Marple spoke gently. "My dear boy, silence often does more harm than the truth." He shook his head violently. "You don't understand." "Then help us too," Miss Marple replied. Geoffrey's breath came fast and shallow. "If I speak, I hurt someone who doesn't deserve it." Miss Marple gave him a compassionate look. "And what of Miriam? Did she deserve her fate?" He crumpled then, knees nearly buckling. Graves caught his arm and steadied him in the chair. Geoffrey buried his face in his hands. "I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. I tried to stop it." Graves' voice hardened. "Stop what?" A long pause stretched, and Geoffrey trembled. Then, in a broken whisper, "She found a letter." Miss Marple's heart tightened. "A letter addressed to you?" "Yes," he choked. "From someone who should never have written it." The vicar made a strangled sound. "Geoffrey, no!" But Geoffrey continued, his control unraveling. "It was from a parishioner," he said, staring past them. "Someone confiding in me, someone married, someone afraid. The letter wasn't improper, only foolish, too intimate. But if it had been read by the wrong eyes..." Graves frowned. "And Miriam saw it." "She didn't mean to," Geoffrey said. "It fell from my coat pocket near the rectory path. She picked it up. She thought she was helping." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "But the author of the letter feared exposure." "Yes," Geoffrey whispered. "Miriam agreed to return it discreetly. But someone saw her take it." Miss Marple caught that subtle phrasing. "Someone saw her. Not you." He nodded. "I didn't know who at first. But then yesterday, she told me she was being followed. She wanted to go to Lily. She trusted Lily." "But she never arrived?" Graves said grimly. Geoffrey shook his head. "Whoever confronted her. I wasn't there. I wouldn't have let them." The vicar suddenly stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Geoffrey, stop this now. You're only making matters worse." Miss Marple turned her gaze on the vicar, her expression deceptively mild. "Reverend, were you aware of the letter?" He froze. A stillness fell over the room, heavy, suffocating. Then, in a voice barely audible, the vicar whispered, "It was my wife." Inspector Graves stared. "Your wife?" "She thought Geoffrey's sympathy meant affection," the vicar said, and each word a painful confession. "I should have seen it. I should have stopped it. But when I learned Miriam had the letter, when I saw her with it, I panicked." Miss Marple's eyes remained tender but unyielding. "Reverend, what did you do?" "I only followed her," he said desperately. "I tried to speak with her, to take the letter back before my wife suffered humiliation, but she ran. I never went near the tower. I swear it." The truth vibrated through his voice. Part guilt, part fear, but not the cold weight of murder. Miss Marple inhaled gently. "Inspector, I believe the Reverend did follow her, but he did not kill her." Graves frowned. "Then who—" Miss Marple looked at Geoffrey. "Mr. Randall said someone saw Miriam take the letter, someone who feared exposure even more than the vicar." Geoffrey's face went white. "You don't mean my uncle's wife?" Miss Marple shook her head softly. "No? Your uncle's wife sought comfort, not harm." Her gaze sharpened. "But someone else knew the letter existed. Someone who feared that Miriam had learned more than she should. Someone who had access to the tower." Someone whose clasp lies beneath the steps. Geoffrey's breath caught. Choir Master Denning. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. He maintained the vestments, and he would have known if a letter had gone astray, particularly one revealing his own impropriety. Graves straightened abruptly. You mean he— Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Miriam discovered not one misplaced confidence, but two, and Mr. Denning, terrified of exposure, confronted her. Things escalated. He dragged her to the tower, perhaps thinking to force her into silence. Geoffrey whispered, some horror-struck, and when she refused, Miss Marple finished softly. He killed her and attempted to frame Mr. Bartlett. Graves turned sharply toward the door. We need to find Denning, now. Miss Marple rose slowly, clasping her hands. The choir master will not run, she said. Men who act out of fear seldom flee. They attempt instead to restore the illusion of order. Her eyes drifted toward the church spire, visible through the rectory window. He will be there, she murmured, setting the stage for his next deception. Graves hurried out. Miss Marple followed at a calm, steady pace. The final thread, she knew, was ready to be pulled. The church stood in a solemn hush as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves approached, its ancient stones absorbing the weight of many secrets. A faint murmur drifted from inside, voices low, deliberate, now controlled. Graves quickened his stride, but Miss Marple lifted a hand gently. Do allow me a moment, Inspector, she murmured. A culprit expecting accusation behaves differently than one caught unaware. Graves hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Miss Marple entered first, her steps soft along the aisle. In the chancel, Choir Master Denning stood beside the vestment cupboard, his back to her as he arranged folded robes with meticulous precision. Too meticulous, a man restoring order where his conscience felt none. My dear Mr. Denning, Miss Marple said gently. He stilled, the cloth in his hands sagging. Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. You've been quite busy, she said, her eyes drifting toward the cupboard. Organizing garments, possibly searching for something. His fingers tightened on the robe. Just routine maintenance. Then after the chaos of the fete, everything is in some disarray. Miss Marple nodded. Chaos often reveals what is hidden beneath the surface. I found one of your robe clasps outside the bell tower. His jaw twitched. Those can fall off. Such things happen. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, but rarely on stone steps where a struggle has taken place. Denning turned sharply, panic flashing. I don't know what you mean. She regarded him with that deceptively kind, unassuming look, an expression that had disarmed many before him. Miriam Bell, she said quietly, did not die by accident, nor did she go willingly to the tower. Someone dragged her there, someone frightened, someone who feared exposure, someone whose temper snaps under pressure. Denning's breath quickened. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle, almost sorrowful. Miriam discovered a letter. Not the vicar's, though that alone frightened him, but another, a letter belonging to you. His eyes widened, horror blooming. A letter, Miss Marple went on, that detailed certain improprieties with a parishioner some months ago, a matter that would have cost you your position, your reputation, and quite possibly your freedom. Denning shook his head violently. No one knows about that. Oh, but they do, Miss Marple said softly. Miriam did. And when you realized she had the letter, you followed her. You confronted her in panic. You may even have begged her to return it quietly. His voice broke. She refused. She said she would tell the vicar's wife. She said I had taken advantage. And so you panicked, Miss Marple finished. A frightened man can do terrible things. Denning's shoulders collapsed inward. I didn't mean to hurt her. I only wanted the letter back, but she ran and I grabbed her arm. She fell, she hit the stairs, and then Then she wouldn't wake. And in desperation, Miss Marple said, you dragged her up the tower, hoping to make it appear she had gone there herself. But the bell rope, when you stumbled against it, it tolled, twice, and the whole village came running. Denning stared at her with hollow eyes. It was an accident. Inspector Graves stepped forward from the aisle shadows, his voice stern. Accident or no, Mr. Denning, you concealed her death and staged the scene, and you attempted to frame Thomas Bartlett. Denning sank to his knees. I was terrified. I thought if they suspected him, they'd stop looking at me. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Fear makes people cruel. Graves ordered a constable, waiting outside, to enter. Denning was escorted away, muttering broken apologies that echoed thinly through the nave. When the church fell silent again, Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath the muted light filtering through stained glass. Graves approached her, his voice softer now. I must say, Miss Marple, you have an extraordinary gift. I had focused too narrowly on Bartlett. She smiled kindly. Many do, Inspector. It is human nature to suspect the anxious rather than the quietly guilty. But people show their truths in the tiniest gestures. Bartlett feared for Lily. Denning feared only for himself. Graves exhaled. And the vicar? A man burdened by shame, not murder, Miss Marple said. He will recover, with time, as will Geoffrey. She turned toward the door, ready to leave the church and its lingering sorrow behind. Outside, the village breathed again, tentatively, cautiously, as though waiting to reclaim its usual rhythm. Mrs. Fernley rushed toward Miss Marple, face flushed with equal parts curiosity and relief. Jane, word is spreading already. They say the murderer has been caught. Miss Marple gave her cousin a small, warm pat on the hand. Yes, my dear Agatha, the matter is settled. And Lily? Mrs. Fernley asked anxiously. She will be fine, Miss Marple said. Truth lifts its weight once spoken. As they walked back toward the Fernley home, the church bells chimed the noon hour. Clear, calm, no longer a harbinger of tragedy. Birds flitted across the rooftops. Children resumed their play along the green, the shadow of fear slowly retreating. Sir Fernley sighed with relief. You've saved us all such misery, Jane. Miss Marple smiled softly. Oh, no. I did very little. It was simply a matter of understanding people. They reveal more than they intend, always. And Miriam? Mrs. Fernley asked quietly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the bell tower one last time, the sun warming the ancient stones. She was a brave girl, she said gently. Braver than she knew. She sought to return a truth where it belonged, and in doing so, she pulled at threads someone wished desperately to keep knotted. Mrs. Fernley squeezed her arm. Well, I suppose St. Brindleford will settle down again. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Villages always do, but they remember too. They reached the gate, and Miss Marple paused before entering. Such tragedies, she murmured, are reminders of how fragile our little worlds can be, yet also how resilient kindness and conscience can prove. With a soft smile, she followed Mrs. Fernley inside. And St. Brindleford, still tender from the unveiling of its darkest secret, eased back into its gentle hum, quiet, watchful, and forever changed by the girl in the bell tower and the truth she refused to let remain hidden.